is an oral history recording with Richard Gibson. The interviewer is Jackie Kirsch, who is a volunteer for the West Volusia Historical Society. Today is May 18th, 2017, and the interview is being recorded at Dick's home, one of the oldest houses in DeLand built by the Codringtons. Dick, how long have you lived in DeLand?
I was actually born in Kentucky in a very small town in the Appalachians where my parents were both teaching at a small college. And so I was 3 when I moved to DeLand in 1946, obviously with the family. And so I, like many a Florida native, I'm not. It's just I almost was, but even my little brother was just 1 year old.
Well, in Florida, that counts.
Yes, yes. Therefore, apparently, I'm old enough in DeLand that my history is history.
Yes.
Okay.
How did you, your family, why did they move to DeLand?
Cold weather, like a lot of other people. Daddy was, like me, very sensitive to cold, and Mother would get a sore throat all winter. And they had lived in Kentucky for quite a few years in the mountains.
And it gets cold.
It gets cold, yes. And so Daddy applied at Stetson, got the job, and we came down and liked it. I don't remember that. I remember that my mother asked if there were any trees in DeLand. All she had seen were beach photos of DeLand. So anyway, I grew up in DeLand. I barely remember Kentucky at all.
What's the origin of your first name? Because I've been told it's Dick.
It is. And I would like to state publicly that when I was a kid, Dick was not a dirty joke. And I know that for a fact because if it had been, in my 7th grade year would have been a perfect misery.
Yes.
But anyway, when my grandmother had her 5th child, the 2 older girls, one of whom was my mother, were about 13, and they wanted to name the baby. And so they decided on the name Dick. And my grandfather said, well, that's not a name, that's a nickname. And he said, I've never known anybody named Dick to amount to a hill of beans.
Oh my goodness.
But if that's what you want, we'll name him Dick. So they named the baby Dick. And that's my uncle, who's been dead for many years now. But anyway, so my actual name is Dick. My parents did put Richard on the birth certificate, but I've tried to shed Dick all my life, especially the last 50 years, but moving back to DeLand proved completely insurmountable. All my high school friends wouldn't know who I was.
You come from a large family or medium size?
I would say medium size for back then. There were originally 5 children. 1 didn't make it. And then I have an older brother, 8 years older, Jack. He also went to DeLand schools. My sister Mary was 4 years older. Then I came along, and then my younger brother is close to 4 years younger. So if I meet anybody in DeLand that in a period of about 15, 20 years, they either knew me, my brother, my sister, or my other brother, and it's been quite convenient.
You've lived in DeLand a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that's, as we were talking earlier, that's kind of the period that we refer to as DeLand as Mayberry. What are your fondest memories of growing up in DeLand?
I would say truly my fondest memories are of throwing rotten grapefruit at people. A good rotten grapefruit with a nice green on the outside has a tremendously satisfying splat, and it also doesn't hurt anybody. Fortunately, I was a bad shot, so that's what pops into my head. I like China berries. You could, using a straw or some such thing, you could shoot them quite along. Those were dangerous.
Yes.
And it was kind of Mayberry in the sense that it never occurred to our parents to do anything about supervision. And when I lived on Pennsylvania, our backyard ran up to Oakdale. And Dean McInerney of Stetson, his property ran up to Oakdale on the other side. So Boo McInerney and Missy Hicks, both of whom were faculty brats like me, were the three of us played together every day. Boo had a woods in her backyard. Our backyard was a complete field, so it was great for flying kites and stuff. But then we'd go climb the trees on Boo's backyard. Anyway, and just went all over.
What would you say were perhaps some of your less fond memories of DeLand?
My less fond memories of DeLand. I was very aware very early of the fact that I walked down this street, North Clara, every day of my life, 4 times. I walked home for lunch and back to school. But I was very aware of the fact that once we crossed Howry, we were in what was called Colored Town. And for a little white kid, it was scary. And I didn't know why this huge gap, but the only times we actually went down there was for the laundry. We didn't have a washing machine. In fact, nobody did right after the war, I don't think.
And this would have been in the 1940s and
this would be like
50s.
1947, 48. And we took our laundry to a lady named Lizzie, wonderful woman who honestly, seriously did it in a big iron pot, boiled it in the yard.
Yes.
And we would go down there to take her the laundry, and then we would go down there to get it. Her husband, whose name slips my mind right now, worked with Daddy in the yard, and not all the time, but it was a huge yard. It went from Pennsylvania to Oakdale, behind all the well, it's covered with houses now, but it was an enormous yard, and I don't even know how we mowed it. Nobody had a riding mower back then or anything like that.
It would have been a push mower with.
I guess, but we're talking about 2 acres.
Yes.
So anyway, as I say, as a child, I didn't understand it. I asked my mother, why the black children didn't go to the beach, and she said because they didn't want to. And being a kid, you believe what you're told. I thought, okay, but later it became very obvious what was going on in my teenage years. And in fact, I never went to an unsegregated school, even to college and graduate school. It was still segregated.
Because the whole civil rights movement started after World War II and reached its peak in the late 50s and 60s. So
I think the Civil Rights Act was 64,
I
and
believe
I graduated
so,
from
yes.
college that year, and it had not taken effect. I went to the University of North Carolina. I suppose black students had been admitted some by then, but not in the graduate English program.
let's talk a little bit about the schools that you remember. What schools did you go to, and what do you remember about them?
If I had been born today, I would have been obviously diagnosed as ADHD. And even I remember that I could not shut up. I talked all the time. My family were angels to not put me out in the doghouse or something. But therefore, when I was just 4 years old, they sent me to kindergarten. I have a feeling it was to get me out of the house. Anyway, so I went to kindergarten. This was in the basement of what is now called the Dempsey Brewster School and was called the Wisconsin Avenue School. Dr. Kahn's wife, whose name I don't know, well, I do, it was Ms. Kahn, and Ms. Rhodes ran a kindergarten in the basement of that school for some years. And I went to school, to kindergarten with a lot of people that I later knew in high school and are now, Jean Fuller, for example, and Jane Edmonds were both in that school. And so was Mary Ann Davis, O.C. Davis's daughter. But then I went to Dempsey Brewster for the 6 years one does, and again walked back and forth down this street 4 times a day. And that was the middle times were for lunch, which is got a little problematic. About unpleasant memories. Summers when I was a kid were very scary. Any public occasion, and especially for things like swimming pools for some reason, were fearful places on account of polio. And in fact, my sister and my mother thinks my younger brother both had polio, but he had no symptoms. Her symptoms, she was never in an iron lung, but she had very severe symptoms. She was she was at Umatilla. There's a children's hospital there for about a year, and then was at Warm Springs for about a year.
That was the center that Roosevelt.
Yes, that Roosevelt, and in fact, he hadn't been dead that long at that time. It was still a pretty new facility. And my mother moved up there. And that's why coming home for lunch was such an oddball thing, because Daddy couldn't boil water. And Jimmy was, like 5 years old. But anyway, Jimmy became the cook. And he would fry bologna every day. And that's what we had for lunch for like a year. Anyway, I have a lot of school memories, but I had interesting teachers that were local. Except first grade, I had a young lady who was only there for 1 year, but I absolutely adored her. Ms. Martin was my second grade teacher. Third grade was Ms. Jackson, who of course was Warren Jackson's wife, and his daughter, Sally Sue, was in my class. I knew Sally Sue real well. And fourth grade was Ms. Clardy, and her house is right across, still there. Some people we know live there, and I was in that house a couple of times. I'm not sure why. Fifth grade was the only male teacher I ever had, and I just loved him, Mr. Shabala. And that was our class. We were born in 42, and the war had already had some emphasis on population. Mm-hmm. Our class kind of pushed the envelope on the numbers. And so that class was in the basement of the junior high school where it met. There wasn't room at Dempsey Brewster, or Wisconsin Avenue as it was then. I also remember Ms. Brewster very well, the principal, with the most astonishing blue hair. And so every time since, when someone has referred to old people as blue hairs, I've thought of Ms. Dempsey.
That was very stylish
Ms.
at
Brewster.
one time.
Yes, she wore it straight back in a bun, and she was a very formidable figure. I was not scared of these people because I was a good kid and did my homework, but a lot of my favorite teachers were absolutely disliked and even hated. My favorite teacher of all time was Miss Mitchell in high school, and she was the French and Latin teacher, and I was not, everybody thinks I'm super smart, and I wasn't. I had a tremendously insane work ethic. If a teacher told me to learn the state capitals by Monday, I knew them. Nobody else did. So I was, the fair-haired child. And so when Miss Mitchell told me to learn the ablative case by, Monday, I did. And I like languages. So that was one. Math I was terrible at, and I had very kindly teachers. Walter Pertz, who was a World War II vet, and a couple of others. Flash Talton was another. He was the science teacher in 7th grade. By that time, I'd moved around the block to junior high school, and then high school was, of course, clear around the block to Clara, in a beautiful building that I miss to this day. Of all the buildings that I wish hadn't disappeared, that's one of the main ones.
That was the high school that burned?
The high school that was later burned. It wasn't burned bad enough to tear it down. I saw it, and that could have been saved, but nobody wanted to. DeLand lost an awful lot in the 60s when everybody was tearing down everything everywhere you went. A lot of the old places were being torn down.
Why do you think there was this period when people just wanted everything new, or that the old places were not good enough?
I don't know. I think it had to do with the war. I know similar things went on in Europe for the reasons that they'd been bombed down.
Yes.
Old things were simply not valued. And of course, it is expensive to renovate a house, or in a building like that would have cost a community-wide effort to have renovated that. I think people wanted the land and didn't, as I say, the old things were not valued. I did, and I grieved over everything that was torn down. We did manage to save the old county courthouse, and that is a brilliant building. That's just wonderful.
It's amazing.
Most of Stetson is intact, and I got very upset when, if those buildings, Stover and Stetson, had been torn down in the 60s, I would have understood it, but to tear it down now seemed wrong, desperately wrong.
Yes.
Anyway.
A lot of people share your
yes, I
feelings
think so.
Particularly Stover. You mentioned that you went to kindergarten, or what we would call kindergarten now, in the basement of Dempsey Brewster, Wisconsin. Now there's a feeling that childhood education is really important to the future progress of a child through the rest of the grades. Do you have any recollections that it helped you in any way, understanding that this was a long way back?
I don't remember any particular methods, although I certainly wish, as they do now, they had included foreign languages. I would love to have started a foreign language at the age of 4. But the one thing I do remember about the education is that in the kindergarten was reading was not included. And Martha McNair, who was a very good friend of mine clear through school days and on nearly to college, she was the daughter of the minister at First Presbyterian, Arch McNair. And in fact, I visited them and her many years later in Montreat in the mountains. But anyway, she could read. I don't know how, but she could read, and I couldn't, and I was so envious I could just die. And otherwise, I remember nothing about the actual education involved. I mainly remember recess. There was, Wisconsin Avenue had a wonderful side yard with big live oak trees, so it was shady and wonderful to run around and scream.
It's still a beautiful building.
It is a beautiful building, yes.
Now the overall school administration building. You said you went on to junior high school, and what grades were covered in junior high?
Junior high school at that time was 7th, 8th, and sort of 9th. Since the schools were so close, they were just a couple of 100 feet apart. The Glee Club, for example, met in the junior high school first floor.
You were a part of the Glee Club?
I was in the Glee Club. Therefore, in the 9th grade, I knew seniors, juniors and seniors, sometimes quite well. And 7th and 8th grade, therefore, was I've already mentioned that my 5th grade class was over at the junior high school, so I was acquainted with the layout. But there was not a definitive move to a different school. Therefore, the 9th grade, which I was kind of glad of, did not involve the hazing and things that freshmen get at a lot of high schools back then and still do, apparently. It was just, we kind of just had some classes in the senior high school building, then the next year we were all there. In fact, the hazing that was involved was sophomore hazing, so it would have been 10th grade.
Oh, when they went on to the high school.
When they were definitively in high school, yeah.
Interesting. Did you continue with Glee Club in high school?
I certainly did, and I loved Glee Club. I took piano from Miss Ethel Fisher, who was at Stetson for. She was not on faculty at Stetson, but she did private lessons there. I took from her for years. I was a tiny little lady. I was very fond of her, and a very good music teacher, I think, looking back on it. And I had some ambitions of being a pianist, but I did not have the talent. That's when I discovered the difference between hard work and talent. To do some things, you have to have both. I had the hard work, but not the talent.
Right.
So anyway, yes, Glee Club was part of my fascination with music, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. When I went on to Stetson, my father, I don't think I've mentioned, was chairman of the English department at Stetson for many years. That's what he came to Florida for. And anyway, so Stetson was free, and I lived at home, which was also free, and teachers didn't make a lot of money, so this was a very good thing. All of my siblings and I went to Stetson and got wonderful educations that we could not have afforded otherwise.
One of the greatest benefits of being a college
absolutely,
brat.
the faculty brat thing worked out there. Living at home was a mistake. In fact, since then, was a college professor as well. Anytime faculty asked me about their children, I said, don't keep them at home. Send them to the dorm, with the reciprocity or whatever. Now I've forgotten what we're talking about. Is that it?
I think we were leading up to, I understand that you actually wrote the alma mater for DeLand High School.
I did.
Was that while you were in school or later?
There was, the high school was about to be replaced, and there was in fact a bond issue that year that passed, and then 2 years later that was the first graduating class. I was in the class of 60, and 62 they graduated from the new one out there.
This is the one that's out on High.
Out in the country at the time. Anyway, I don't know why, but the school teachers decided that what had been our alma mater, I'll have to sing it to you to show them why they didn't like it. Love and honor to DeLand High School, old and grand. That's how it went. So they wanted a proper alma mater that could be used at graduation, and that's obviously a fight song. It ends with hey, hey, hey. So they had a contest for the words. And I have no idea who all, I assume some other people entered, but anyway, I won it. And so the alma mater at DeLand High School still credits me with the words, but I have always thought what made it is the music, which Bob Allman wrote. He was the Glee Club director for many years. And he wrote the music, and I always thought it was just beautiful. And I think that's why they still use it and still treasure it.
Would you sing a little bit of it for us?
I do not know it. I remember that I graduated and went off to college while they were using the. I think the first time I heard it was when I came back for my 50th, except him playing the piano with it. We sang it that year, introduced it, but so I do not remember the music, and I definitely don't remember the words that I wrote, but they look familiar when I see them.
Kind of switching around a little bit, you mentioned the illness of your sister, Mary. Did she recover completely, or has that continued to?
No, she continued to have health problems really all her life. She led a normal life, but her left leg was a little shorter, so she had without a slight prosthesis, she had a limp, and she had multiple operations on her hands to get them functional. The thumbs had been paralyzed, so and she just she was never a happy child, and she was never a happy adult either. But she was unfortunately she worked very hard. She was the librarian at DeLand High School for many years, and she hated that. Largely being an old maid school teacher is what she
Yes.
hated most. She didn't hate the job particularly. And she put every penny into retirement and did retire, but she had breast cancer and it came back. And so 3 months after she retired, she was gone.
Oh,
And I've always thought that was so sad because
Yes.
she was just about to finally move on into something that she wanted to do. In fact, what she wanted to do was to be a librarian on a cruise ship.
Oh,
Maybe
What
just
is
for
it?
a year or so,
Yeah.
but just something completely different.
Different.
That's what she wanted to do.
right. That's too bad. You said that your father taught English and was head of the department. You went on to teach English.
Yes, I did.
Did you make that choice because of your father, or was it?
Absolutely not. I never had any desire to follow in my father's footsteps. It was, although looking back on it, it was the ideal profession for me personally. My only real strong suit is words. As I say, I tried music, I even tried art for a while, no talent either way. And I do have a talent for words. But I went to Stetson intending to be a psychology major. I discovered that was about rats and boxes, and the first required course was statistics, and math is not my strong suit. This was not a field that I needed to go into,
Right.
so I became an English major. And I went through Stetson fine, and I had very little feeling of a college education because I lived at home.
Yes.
So I was still hanging out with my high school friends and so forth. It just, and we lived right across the campus, so I just walked over. It didn't feel like college to me. That's why I say I've advised faculty brats not to do that. Then I got partly through Dean McInerney, who was a very good friend of our family. In fact, he taught me to swim, not my dad. My dad wouldn't go in cold water like DeLand Springs, and that's where I learned to swim. But anyway, Dean McInerney was a marvelous man, and I say I was good friends with his daughter and still am.
That was Hugh McInerney.
Hugh
for
McInerney,
whom
yes.
the top student award.
The top
is
student
now.
award is named, yeah.
Yes.
In fact, it's odd to be around Stetson because all of these student awards and fellowships and so forth are for people.
Yes.
And I knew them as people,
Yes.
not as awards. So, in fact, the major English department award is the Byron H. Gibson Award,
Yes.
which has gotten to be quite a successful award.
Yes.
But anyway, Hugh McInerney would have Tuesdays at his house where he and his wife would serve coffee, and just any students that wanted to come could talk about anything, just come and talk. And he was instrumental, I think, in getting me a scholarship. And so I certainly, Vietnam was also lurking at this time. So I went on to graduate school. And Vietnam was beyond lurking. It was very real and very scary.
Yes.
And I had a student deferment, and that lasted until I was there for 7 years. I loved Chapel Hill, and I didn't really want to finish and get out in the real world. No, being a graduate student is just you're around people that are interested in the same things
Yes.
that you are. And that was reading and discussing, and it was an ideal life.
Yes.
However, I finally got a PhD and did go get a job and moved on out of that. By then, I was really too old for the draft. I never had a real job until I was 30, and that's kind of embarrassing.
Well, where was your first job?
Downtown Atlanta, there was at the time a high-rise, it's still there, Georgia State University was my first job. And I really, talk about no feeling of a campus, just there's a high-rise and a parking deck. The parking deck had been converted into classrooms and stuff. Actually, it made an ideal classroom building. You just walked up and down these huge ramps, but I really did not like it there, and left several years later for a much smaller school. It was a branch of the old Mercer University, which is a Baptist school in Macon, but they had a branch in Atlanta, and I was very happily there for quite a few years, and however, I outgrew Atlanta drastically. It was just, it outgrew me, I probably should say. It was just too much traffic. I was no longer happy there.
Life is scary.
Yeah, the winters were perfectly horrible. It's close enough to the mountains to attract moisture. So winters were just gray and gloomy and
they have ice storms.
They have ice storms, nothing fun like snow. And so I decided to move back to Florida and just kind of quit my job there and move to Jacksonville, which was either foolhardy or bold, but I was very lucky to get a wonderful job at Jacksonville University. And I spent 25 years there very happily. I really enjoyed that job.
Yeah. Looking back over all these years of many different kinds of experiences, what's your most memorable experience, or what is the one that you would like to keep remembering if you could select something?
It wouldn't be anything a long time ago. I found growing up to be quite difficult. In fact, I don't think I was a mature adult until about the age of 50. So before that, except for some a few very sunny not high school. Actually, I liked high school. I was president of the student body, but I didn't. I just was uncomfortable all those years, and so I would say, frankly, moving back to DeLand is probably, without question, the best thing I have ever done. And that was not a sentimental reason at all. I had no desire to move back to DeLand. In fact, I'd looked at a variety of places like St. Augustine, close to Jacksonville, where, I had friends in Jacksonville.
Yes.
And I came to my 50th high school reunion in 2010 out at Gene and Frank Underhill's on the lake. We did the parade downtown and all. And the first thing that happened that morning was I ran into Mary Ann Davis, who was a good friend since kindergarten. And after the ceremony at the high school, she said, let's go downtown to the Thai restaurant. And I'm thinking, DeLand has a Thai restaurant? And she said, yes, and it's an excellent Thai restaurant. So I also discovered Sidewalk Cafes, De La Vega, and downtown. And she said she had moved back nearly 10 years ago. And I said, I was thinking, why would anybody move back to DeLand? Well, anyway, by the next day when we were out at Gene and Frank's on the beautiful lake with a couple of glasses of wine, I thought, well, now I get it. And I went in Monday morning and told JU that I was retiring, which they had no idea of, because I had no idea. It wasn't immediate. You can't do that.
Right.
So I had, and this was already late October, so I had to give them the next year. And then came down, thanks to the 21st century, I went online, found a real estate personage and houses to look at.
Yes.
Came down the next week. And within 10 days of that reunion, there was a contract on this house. And
you said you had always loved Clara Avenue.
I did, still do. It, except it is probably the most intact, except for Minnesota and
Yes.
Clara, the most intact street in town. And it looks very much, except much better. None of these houses, these were all painted white, and most of them were kind of dingy looking.
Yes.
And I knew people in these houses. The Hathaways lived here. Kathleen Johnson, who was one of the Allens, lived across the street in that house over there with her two sons, whom I knew. And I would always pass through here. That was a new neighborhood where I grew up on Pennsylvania and Florida. And this was old, established DeLand, and I
Yes.
felt more like I belonged here.
Yes.
So I didn't think I could afford these houses, but it was the bottom of the depression, the recent recession, we're
Yes.
calling it, I guess. And I had a house that I owned in Jacksonville, so I could put a mortgage on that. This house was under $100,000, and I just couldn't pass it up. Yes, it needed a lot of work, but at that price, I could afford to put some work into it.
And what was this house?
What was it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that is a very long story. The part that you and I are sitting in here was built in 1878, which is 3 years before Henry DeLand built a house. There was a family of 7. Colonel Codrington and his wife Frances built this house. They had 5 children. There were 2 rooms, and there's a beam across this room there. So this was probably a hall and parlor house instead of a central hallway house.
Right.
But this was it for the downstairs, a fairly large room here and a rather small one over there. This is not the original stairwell. The stairwell came down about to here. It was with risers like
Very
that.
steep.
You can see where it was painted, the outline of it was painted inside that closet. And anyway, 7 people lived in this house. By the time the Hathaways bought it, it had been moved once, added onto twice, otherwise boogered with. That is not the front of the house where we came in. That is the side of the house. That is the front of the house that way. Those 2 windows were probably front doors. Anyway, it's been so radically changed that it is delightfully non-historic, or historic in so many different periods. Eclectic, yeah. And we enjoy every piece of it. We enjoy the 1925, the hysterical. The kitchen commenced to cave in a couple of years ago and forcing us to redo the kitchen. But so they said, well, you got to take the floor off to see what's there. There were 2 joists in the whole kitchen. They said only the owner could have done that. He said no contractor in the world ever put 2 joists under a room that size. But so we're renovating it, but we're trying to leave every period as intact as when we came across it. There's nothing that we wanted to tear off, and for historical accuracy, this house no longer has historical accuracy.
Right. But the Codringtons came from the West Indies, and it kind of has a feeling of the West Indies.
I think so,
Planta's
too.
place.
Actually, when the realtor drove me up here, I didn't quite recognize the house, because when you come from the driveway, you see the added-on parts. It doesn't look like this from the street. And I thought, that is a Caribbean farmhouse. And but they said no, it was built in 1937, and that's the official date of this house. But I only found out later that the house is much older. 1937 is when the kitchen and bathroom were added on, and it was remortgaged, and that's what it dates from according to the tax rolls and so forth. But the Codringtons are an ancient family in England. They'd been in the south of England near Bristol documented since the Middle Ages in a village named Codrington. And a young man, for some reason, one of them moved to the West Indies in 1628. And the West Indies were barely, there was only one English settlement there at that time, which was Barbados. I don't think Jamaica had been founded as a British. And in the United States, there was only Plymouth and Jamestown. And
Goodness.
so that's how long ago they were there.
Yeah.
Later, a branch of the family moved to Jamaica, and that's who came here.
Right. We're kind of teasing a little bit because we're going to do more on the Codringtons
That's
later.
right.
Very interesting
This house
family.
is a DeLand history lesson and partakes of all periods of DeLand. Yes.
Yes, it certainly does. Looking back over your experiences, which were certainly varied, what advice would you give a young person today? What would you have done differently if you were starting over again?
The advice is everything you're gonna get out of life involves hard work. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not gonna get much out of life. And that comes from 47 years as a teacher, mainly.
Yes.
And I could tell within 1 week, I could have given everybody in the class their grades for the semester because it was obvious who was willing to work, who was willing to do, and I too had sat in the back row, and actually I never did. I never sat in the back row. I always wanted to be up front. But I credit any success I've had entirely to pure luck. On the one hand, I happened to be in the place that, like Jacksonville University was looking for somebody
Yes.
in English when I happened to be there.
Yes.
But everywhere I've been, it's easy to make yourself indispensable. People do not want to work extra things. They're busy with their own stuff. So I would always volunteer to be secretary of this. Oh yeah, you need somebody to wipe the floors, I'll do that. Whatever it was, and after a while they realize you're running the place and give you a job. So I've been very disturbed at what they call the millennials the last few years I was teaching, because they appeared less and less interested in hard work and definitely did not understand the relationship between hard work and success. And that is scary. For all of us.
It certainly is. I know you're a long way from having to decide that, but how would you like to be remembered?
Well, one never knows how far one is from that.
That's true.
And as a matter of fact, we already have a very nice tombstone up in Oakdale Cemetery. That Mike Baldoff did. We wanted to get him to do it while his wife could still do the artwork.
Yes.
She has rheumatism in her hands.
Oh.
But I think what I would like to be remembered for, at least in DeLand, is as a very happily married gay person, a gay couple. The neighbors are completely comfy with that. We are completely comfy with that. And when Reinhard and I were young, there simply was no such thing. And if it was revealed at all, it was the greatest shame. So I'm sure it's not visible to the camera, but that's us on our wedding day in front of a beautiful New England church near Boston.
I was wondering where the church
Yeah,
was.
well, it's actually on, it's Lexington. It's on Battle Green.
Oh.
The photographer is standing in Battle Green to take that picture where the first shots of the Revolution were fired. We did not choose the church for the symbolism and didn't realize all that till we got there. The very dynamic young pastor was interested, and at the time we could not get married in Florida. So this was, in fact, yesterday was our 3rd anniversary.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
We didn't talk very much about Reinhard, but we will in the
Yes.
next one, because he's very much a part of this house.
Especially everything that is visible garden-wise in our opening shots are, in fact, I keep seeing him out here. He's working in the backyard right now. And but anyway, yes, the yard is definitely his creation, and I just kind of stand back and let him do it because I can't do that anymore. My back gave out years ago.
Thank you so much, Dick, for sharing your memories.
Well,
They're going to be very important to a lot of people.
well, good, and thank you for being a most enjoyable interviewer, and to all these people that no one else can see who are helping to do this.
Thank you.